Welcome, I'm Tracy with KOGmissions.com, and today we're going to learn more about Michael Servetus, or Miguel Cervette. Joining me is Carlos Xaviar of Restoration Fellowship. Welcome, Carlos.
Hello, Tracy. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. And I've seen your presentations that you've done on Servetus in the past, and like many people, I had never heard of him or his tragic death at the hands of John Calvin. And many people don't realize that that very same spirit of Calvinism lives on in many professing Christians and churches today. So, Carlos, when did you first read or hear about Servetus's life story?
Well, first of all, thank you again, because this merits a lot of attention, especially from self-professed Christians today. As you rightly say, it's a story that is yet to be told, really. Although prominent Calvinists, leaders of the Calvinist movement today, like John Piper and others, do know the story, and it's actually known as the Servette or the Servetus affair. Well, actually, let me put it this way. I first came upon the name Miguel Cervet in my studies of Trinitarianism. So I became a Christian at 32. I had no religious background. I didn't even go to church. So when I started reading the Bible for the first time and came upon very quickly the so-called doctrine of the Trinity, that God exists in three persons. In other words, God is not just the Father, the God and Father of Jesus, as the New Testament calls God, the one God of Israel, who in the Old Testament is called Yahweh or Jehovah, however you want to say it, by the way. So in my studies of this doctrine of the Trinity, you come upon names of people like Miguel Servet, and there are many others, by the way. Miguel Servet is probably the most prominent of the early so-called martyrs because of his involvement with this John Calvin, who became a movement unto himself. And so that's how I came to the name Servet, and then to his great. It's a great story, but it's a great tragedy as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you're very passionate about this story, and even the first time I saw it was about 10 years ago. Would you start maybe by telling us a little bit more about who Miguel Cervette was, about his life and his tragic and horrific death?
Certainly. And I will actually recommend people to see the Wikipedia article on Miguel Servet using his Latinized or English form of the name Michael Servetus. It's actually a rather comprehensive article that someone put together through the years. When I first came upon the article in the Wikipedia, it was maybe 3 paragraphs. This is back in 2006. So I think many Christians, perhaps coming out of Trinitarianism, Catholicism, evangelicalism, perhaps now they're coming to the view of Servet, which is the non-Trinitarian view. So he was born in Spain. I actually had the great honor and opportunity to visit his birthplace, and it's a place called Villanueva de Sigena, which is in the region of Aragon in Spain. And yes, he's born in this little town. To this day, it's maybe, if I remember, 3 streets. That's it. Like, it's a very small town. So Miguel, like many children back then, this is early 16th century. So he's born around 1509, 1511. It's disputed, but he's born in the early 1500s. Like most kids, most people, he's born into a Catholic system. So Spain is staunchly Catholic, as you know, and it's the birthplace, unfortunately, of the Inquisition, the infamous Spanish Inquisition. So he's Catholic. He's trained in Catholicism. He actually has a brother who becomes a monk, a Catholic monk. And in that city of Villanueva, there's actually like most cities, a Catholic church, a very small one. So it's believed that's where his brother actually worked when he became a monk. So let's see what else. He was very much a genius child. So he learns Greek, Hebrew, Latin by his teenage years. So by the time he's 14, 18 years old, this guy can speak, write, read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and of course his native Spanish. He takes a great interest in the Bible. I think he really was zealous for the Bible. It wasn't just because, well, he's born into a Catholic system in 16th century in Spain and he has to, study the Bible. I think he really was in love with the Bible. And yeah, he's very much a boy genius. So by the time he's 20 years old, it's believed around 19 or 20 years old, he writes his first book. It's called On the Errors of the Trinity. So, it's great controversy in his little town. And he actually follows it up by other controversial books. The second one is called Dialogues on the Trinity. So early on, he comes across what becomes known as biblical Unitarian, or at that time, the Socinian view of Christ, that he begins in the womb of Mary, as Luke, the Gospel of Luke tells us. And he pretty much calls the Trinity demonic, but by his early 20s, he's very convinced. So you can imagine, he becomes the subject of both Catholic and Protestant persecution early on. And then he's driven into seclusion for the rest of his adult life. And then in his early 40s, he comes out of seclusion. And for some unknown reason to this day, he tries to see John Calvin. And he actually pursues this meeting with John Calvin that eventually gets him killed. So he did reach out at the time to other reformers, Martin Luther and others, but they all reject him. They all call him all kinds of names, demonic. They actually, get this right, the early reformers are fleeing the Catholic Church themselves. Yet they hated this man so much, they actually report him to the Catholic authorities. I mean, how evil is that? Now, he finally gets caught in Geneva, in modern day Switzerland, and he's eventually burned alive at the stake at the behest of John Calvin. Actually, John Calvin was his prosecutor in the trial. I mean, it's an incredible story. It's really like a Hollywood story. Now, the reason we actually know the name Miguel Servet, Michael Servetus, is because hundreds of years later, so he's killed, I believe, in 1553. And then maybe 300 years later, European medical professors actually discover that he had discovered the pulmonary circulation. He was the first European to find that out. So that's how much of a genius this guy. He was also a cartographer, a map maker, a physician. He worked as what we would call a GP for 20 years or something. And he was an astronomer as well. He studied, the heavens and the stars and so on. So he's actually found by the medical community in Europe in the 1800s for that discovery, not for his religious convictions and the reason he died. But to this day, it's unfortunate, and that's why I thank you for doing this. It's unfortunate because they still claim him as one of their own, it feels like. He's still yet to be known for what he really lived and died, which was his love of the Bible and his belief that Jesus was the Son of God and not God the Son. So that's, to me, a very, very tragic thing, even to this day. But his birthplace that I went to, and I met a man there, the curator, as it were, the director of the center, who I think he's still the director. His name was Sergio Opi. Very nice man. I actually have a picture. I'm very fond of this picture. I'll just show it here for the benefit of the recording, if you can see that. So that's Sergio there next to Sir Anthony, and then that's his the lady. Actually, the lady was the curator. He's the director. That's my wife and myself when I was younger, and my hair was black. So, so I'm very fond of this photo. You know, I always keep it near me. So yeah, that's really the story of Servetus, and he dies a tragic death. I actually, once again, was lucky and honored to visit the place where he was burned in Geneva a couple of years ago now with our brother Alexander. Just give out a shout out to Alexander out there, who's on YouTube, by the way. He has a German Swiss ministry, and he took us to. He was our sort of guide as well, and Alec in Switzerland, and it's emotional. You know, it's emotional to be there to know the story, and it's a little hill. It's on a little sort of mount. It's called the hill in Chapelle, I believe, and there's actually a big, massive hospital across the road from. They put a monument. The libertarians, the medical people, not religious people. So all the monuments you might see or know about Servetus were donated, created, and bought by non-religious people, which is again tragic. Because also the Christian community to this day hates Servetus or Servet. They do. You know, he died a heretic, and to most of Christianity, that is Trinitarian, we are heretics. So libertarians and people for the tolerance of religious pursuit and other ideas have taken him on board. But there is a hospital named after him, by the way, in Geneva. The street is named after him as well. So it's good to see, but it's also tragic that really the Christian community, which should, accept him as a Christian, as the Christian that he lived and died. But unfortunately, to this day, and we'll get to that with, with what's wrong to this day.
So Carlos, how did he end up getting caught and put on trial and actually murdered?
Well, like I said, it's really a sort of a mystery. All we know is that he is caught, get this, on a Sunday morning in the church where John Calvin was preaching. They identified him somehow, and they caught him in Geneva. Now, there are many theories. It's believed that he again was trying to talk to John Calvin, and this time one-on-one. Now, there is some evidence that they did meet in the early 20s. So I believe, from memory, I believe Servet was 3 or 4 years older than Calvin. And they did meet apparently in hiding when Calvin was coming out of Catholicism. Remember, Calvin was a Catholic priest, a very well-educated, one of the up-and-coming Catholic priests, but he obviously protested and became an early reformer. So they did meet early on. So how he was caught, we believe that he was trying to gain another audience, because through his years undercover, as it were, Servet was sending Calvin letters. There are many hundreds of letters. There are books written on this, by the way, the correspondence between them. Servet even sent him copies, proof copies, as it were, of his works. Actually, one of his last books, Servet wrote, is called The Restoration of Christianity, and he actually sent Calvin a copy. So that it's believed, it's all theories, but it's believed he was trying once again to maybe appeal to this man Calvin personally, but yeah, he wouldn't have none of it. He was arrested. He was thrown in a dungeon, eaten by rats or nibbled by rats, as it were. And by the time he goes to the stake, it was maybe 3-4 months in the dungeon, like the movies you see. This guy was in a dungeon, and they were trying to get a confession out of him. Calvin visited him many times in the dungeon, trying to basically get him to recant. But you have to give it to Servet. He remained true to his convictions, as we say. Protestants celebrate Reformation Sunday on October 31st, as you know. And it's funny because days before, on October 27, Servet was killed, was burned alive at what I call at the Reformation stake. So how ironic is that? And I actually have a quote here I just want to share with your audience from a book called Beacons of the Light by Braybrook. It's a very moving quote. To prolong his agony, new wood was used that took longer to burn. This is describing the stake. His last words were, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me." Sorry, get a bit emotional. Calvin ordered to hunt for and destroy any remaining copies of his works, but in fact, in what is an amazing story in itself, 3 copies survive, including Calvin's annotated personal copy in his library, end quote. So that's a quote from this book, Beacons of the Light. Now, few, if any, at the time, Christian leaders condemned this killing. Only one man stood up, and he was a Catholic, by the way. His name was Sebastian Castellio or Castellon. And he's famous because he, like, immediately afterwards, he was the only brave soul. And he wrote actually a refutal against Calvin. And it's actually, the work is called Contra Calvin in Latin. And there's this famous quote, "To kill a man is not to protect the doctrine, but it is to kill a man. To protect the doctrine is not the magistrate's affair. What has the sword to do with doctrine? But the teachers. To seek truth and to utter what one believes to be true can never be a crime. No one must be forced to accept a conviction. Conviction is free." So I love that quote. It's very famous. It's used in a lot of different scenarios, by the way. If I can just speak to the legacy of Miguel Servet. So because of him and others, not just him, but unfortunately there were many other people, including women who stood up against Catholicism and early Protestantism, especially against the doctrine of the Trinity. Some women did stand up. They were not burned alive. No, they had a better way to, so they thought at the time. Oh no, they're women. So what do? We put you in a sack. We tie you up and close you in a sack and throw you in the water. So they drowned the women. So just an awful time. But his death, Servet's death, and the death of others led to the religious freedom laws in Europe, specifically the first edict of religious toleration by the monarch of Transylvania, which is now modern day, what is it, Romania or Hungary. And that was in 1559. So how great is that, right? Servet is burned, what is it, 1554, and just a couple of years later, there's this monarch, and he enacts this law in 1559. Actually, it was a Queen Isabella. I actually visited the tomb of this queen, now that I remember, when I was in Romania, which I was very honored to be in as well. Romania, by the way, like Poland and Hungary, are famous non-Trinitarian places. Like, people go and do pilgrimages there. If I can read a section from the Edict of Religious Toleration from 1559, Each person should maintain whatever religious faith he wishes, with old or new rituals, while we at the same time leave it to their judgment to do as they please in the matter of faith, just so long as they bring no harm to bear on anyone at all. End quote. So isn't that great? And this, of course, influenced the great English free thinker John Locke, and then the so-called founding fathers of this country, the United States, which we are very glad to be in, by the way. And it influenced people like Thomas Jefferson to write his famous separation of church and state letter, I believe, to Virginia, to the Virginia colony. So yeah, and that was the legacy of not only Servet, but I must name others. And at the end, I'll give some names out, some shout outs to those people.
So, Carlos, would you share a little bit with us your thoughts on how this has impacted you personally and why it's so important to you to honor this man's memory?
It showed to me, anyway, early in my Christian walk. I became a Christian at 32 years of age, relatively late. It showed me the true Spirit of God and where the Spirit of God is and in who it is. So it shows you that, if anything, right, we're supposed to love our enemies. And it's not very loving to not only capture your enemy and incarcerate your enemy, throw them in a dungeon for 3-4 months without much food, eaten by rats, and then kill your enemy, and in the probably one of the most awful ways, burned alive. So why does it matter? Because it should tell you, if anything, right? A lot of Christians are sick of, this word doctrine. Oh, look, it's about, let's just love each other. Well, let's just love each other. Christians, Christians around the world talk about loving one another, right? But what has been done in the name of Christ, let's say, has not been very loving. Not only in the case of Miguel Servet, but in the wars that self-professed Christians continue to partake of to this day. I mean, we're here in the great United States of America. Like I said, I'm very glad to be here. Knowing other countries, my own home country of Nicaragua, so-called third world countries, you don't want to be there, folks. Trust me, this is one of the best places, if not the best place to be in. But it does have its negative aspects. I mean, people think this is a Christian nation. Yet, this nation acts and enacts policies that are obviously anti-Christ. And by that, I mean, I go back to the Spirit of God versus this spirit of hate and violence and war and so on. As you read Servetus, and many of his writings survive, thank God, to this day, I also see him as like, that's me. Like, I don't know if I would have been as brave as he was to take my convictions all the way to the stake. But when I read his works, it's like me. It's how I think, or how I was thinking at the time. I mean, I read Servetus back in 2007. We're in 2021 now. So, and it's just the similar ways of thinking about, especially the Trinity, like his, if you might call it, arguments, like his sense of things. So that I also found a sort of similarity in his writings to my own thinking.
Thank you for that.
Well, this is the question, Tracy. So why are we talking about this, right? I think history, first of all, should be something that Christians should take seriously. So, of course, our primary study is the Bible, the scriptures, primary in your life. But I think a close second, if anything, is history. I mean, think about it. The New Testament are historical books as well. For example, if it wasn't for Luke and his Acts of the Apostles, we wouldn't know much about the Christian movement in its earliest form. So they are history books. So it is very important to know about history. But why this matters in particular, the story of Miguel, why this should be important to you is because of the change it brought about in the state, in government. It led to the toleration laws that we are so fortunate to have today in countries like Australia. Well, first of all, let's start with the United Kingdom or Britain, and then it just went everywhere from there. So it led to government change, religious tolerance. It influenced, like I just said earlier, the amendment laws in this country. The First Amendment of the United States is the most important. That's why it's called the first, which is life, liberty, right, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think finally, why it's important is because it shows what sometimes suffering for the faith means. It shows you what Christ talked about when he said, "They will kill you, they will drag you out of the synagogues." And by they, he meant religious people. And not just any old religious people. He was talking about his own fellow Jews, by the way, who are non-Trinitarians, right? Judaism is non-Trinitarian. So it shows that the true faith of Christ is to love your enemy, even to the point of a horrible death by getting burned alive at the stake. So,
well, as you said, Carlos, I know a lot of things really haven't changed a whole lot in the Christian community other than not burning people at the stake right now. I know in the past I've felt hatred and animosity towards myself, and I've seen it directed at other like-minded brethren very often on social media, and especially when there are debates, in the chat going on. And sometimes it seems like that all they really need is a match, and they would do the same thing to us today. I know we have this video clip we want to share, and when we watch that, I think that real feeling comes out in that video.
yes, that's the sad thing about this whole tragedy, that, Jesus said in Matthew 5 that if you have hate in your heart for your fellow human being, you're practically murdering them. So, when I have to go through tons of comments that I have to review before approving, for example, on our YouTube channel, and I see the hatred every time I do that. You're going to hell. You're calling Jesus a sinner. What do you mean Jesus is not God? And so it's very hateful. The vitriol, the F-bombs sometimes. And these are self-professed Christians. So it's a very sad situation. And again, if you have that sort of hate in your heart, in your mind, not just towards other people, Tracy, but towards other self-professed Christians. And just quickly, one of the things that sticks out when you study the history of our view that has been shared by many, many people especially since the Reformation Day. Actually, you can try and look for a book called The Radical Reformation. It just shows you the many tens of thousands of people since. So I'm talking 16th century, 17th century. This country, by the way, most of the early churches in the colonies of the American colonies, as they were called, were non-Trinitarians. Institutes like Harvard, Yale, their membership, their boards were there were seated non-Trinitarians. And your good question about have things changed? Have people changed? Self-professed Christians in Christianity, has it changed? So, and as a proof of that, I have a video that I edited some time ago now. It will show you, though, the type of thing that we're talking about, and then you can make up your own mind about it.
One thing that I could change about Calvin, well, there's probably several. I think one would be, I would love to have heard more from him about his conversion. If I can throw in a couple other quick things. I wish Calvin had given a greater hearing to the Anabaptists. Now, granted, there were some radicals among the Anabaptists who advocated social unrest and who had apocalyptic visions for the end of the world that were very disruptive. But I think their extremism closed him off to what they had recovered of biblical truth concerning believers' baptism. And then lastly, I wish that he'd written a commentary on the book of Revelation.
I would say it would probably be his attitude toward the arts. And not because I have a complaint about his attitude in principle.
I wouldn't change anything because he is glorified in heaven, and thus there's nothing to change.
Another question that many people coming to the Servetus house put to us is whether Calvin was directly involved in Servetus' death, and taking into account the historical documents, we can say that, or we can argue that Calvin was indeed directly involved in his death, and we can say that he instigated his death in front of the municipal authorities. I think nowadays nobody can deny that.
Anyone who has any questions about whether or not Calvin's role in the Servetus affair was in any significant sense sinful, if I can put it that strongly, that you read any of the really, really first-class biographies. What becomes clear is that the decision was taken entirely out of Calvin's hands. He was more or less just in a theologically advisory position. It was put on the magistrates in Geneva. They were not going to let Calvin be the one to make the decision because, in fact, they were at that time bumping heads with him in a significant way. It was necessary with Servetus to make clear that the Protestants were willing to be as firm against heresy as the Catholics were. In fact, Servetus had already been more or less in absentia condemned by the Catholics. And so the Protestants, because they in fact could be taken to be softer on heresy, needed to take a stand.
But I think we need to keep things in context in light of what was happening at that time, and also Calvin's overall view of church discipline and the desire to restore a person to the true religion. I think I read somewhere that oftentimes when Calvin was preaching, he would just stand up and start yelling and disrupting the sermon. Probably not the best thing to help the sheep grow in their faith.
It's not as if he was out for blood and others were not in that way. And certainly there are some things in the 21st century that we do better than people in the 16th century did. And we can look back and say, gee, we wish Calvin had been different, but this was the standard operating procedure in the 16th century.
Yeah, it is important to remember, it's so foreign to our way of thinking today that, as Mark said, heresy in those days was considered a public crime. Not just a private matter of opinion. It was considered to be disruptive to the fabric of society. It was viewed on the same level as robbery or murder or something, or a civil rebellion. Would it help for you to just give somebody to give a little bit of more historical background as to exactly who this guy was and what actually happened?
Servetus was a bad man.
And he was burned at the stake. Next question.
Servetus was a bad man.
And he was burned at the stake. Next question.
That's just incredible, Carlos. And these men call themselves Christians, followers of Christ. And I'm not sure which Christ they follow, but they're not big on following Jesus's teachings on loving their enemies.
Yeah, I think that's right, Tracy. And anyone who happens to watch this video, ask yourself one question, regardless of doctrinal matters, doctrine, dogma, you know, whether I believe Jesus was God or not, or whatever. But just ask yourself a simple question. This is the simple central question that I ask myself as a born-again Christian at 32 years of age. If anything, right, if anything else is true or false, is that attitude, is that mindset the spirit of Christ? That's it. That's all you gotta do. And that's what I did early on. I said, well, if this is the spirit of Christ and what these people represent in terms of other teachings about Jesus, God, the kingdom, the gospel, and so on, does it really matter? Because Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 is clear, crystal clear. Paul says, I can have all the gifts, I can have all the knowledge and the right knowledge, the true gifts. But if I do not have love, I'm like a clanging cymbal, like an empty shell, basically. It's a metaphor, obviously. So just ask yourself that simple central question in whatever doctrinal pursuits, biblical pursuits, church pursuits. If you're church hopping, just ask yourself that question, and I hope it helps you.
Could you share a list of denominations today that follow Calvin and his teachings? Because when I was growing up, I had never even heard of this. And I think a lot of people may attend churches or support them and not even know that a lot of these teachings are at the root of their historical beginnings?
Yeah, and this is again a very good question. And anyone who calls themselves a Reformed Baptist, it's sort of a code word for Calvinism. Another denomination is Presbyterians. So anyone who calls themselves a Presbyterian or a Presbyterian church, again, they probably hold to this type of teachings that led to the burning of Miguel Servet. And similar to the Reformed Baptists, there are what's known as the Reformed churches. So anyone who calls himself the Reformed Church of Christ or whatever. So the Reformed word is like the code word of Calvinism.
So Carlos, would you finish up by showing us your website and telling us a little bit more about a few other people that have been persecuted for their faith over the years?
Sure. So you will put in the description to this video a couple of websites you can go to. One of them is from our good friend, Dr. Marian Hillar. That's Hillar. And his website is Socinian.org. And he's probably the foremost expert on Servet. And he actually has been very kind to give us a couple of very rare translations of Miguel's last book, The Restoration of Christianity. So a shout out and a thank you to Dr. Hillar. There's also Servetus.org, and that's the one I told you about earlier with Sergio Opi. I believe he's still the director of Servetus.org, and that's a Spanish-English website. So it's primarily run by the Spanish community there in Villanueva de Sigena, which is the region in Aragon. So that's Servetus.org. And and lastly, I will recommend just one book, really. I mean, there are a couple of good books. I quoted some in that video that we played, Out of the Flames by the Goldsteins. I think it's a husband and wife team who wrote that book. That's a very good book, but let me recommend you this one. And this is really a comprehensive work. Did Calvin Murder Servetus? That's why I named the video that. And Stanford Reeves, Esquire. Now, that's obviously a pen name, as they call it, a pseudonym. But in the back of the book, it says he's a California attorney. So this is really a sort of judicial look, but also a historical look. I mean, look how thick this book is. The footnotes in this book are as good as the main body of the text, because this person did so much research on this matter, and it gives you not just the point of view of a lawyer, but it also gives you a lot of good theological information about what Servetus really believed, as opposed to what became known as Protestantism. And in the back, I just want to read this quickly. It says, in 1535, Calvin wrote a leading work of the Reformation called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. In the 1540s, Servetus wrote Calvin a scribbled insult on a page of the Institutes. It said anyone who held Calvin's doctrine of infant baptism, quote, had a demon. So that was Servet, right, to Calvin. In 1546, Calvin told Farel was his sort of right-hand lieutenant, that he would not let Servetus leave Geneva alive if Servetus set foot in Geneva. Did Calvin make that decision to kill Servetus based upon spiritual principles, or did he seek revenge? Did Calvin murder Servetus? A lawyer of Reformed training carefully examines the case. So this man, this Stanford Reeves, is a Calvinist. I don't know if he's still a Calvinist, but he concludes Calvin did indeed deliberately murder Servetus, contrary to Calvin's own principles and the Laws of Geneva. So I mean, this is all you need, really. It's an explosive work by a Calvinist. I don't know if he's still a Calvinist. I hope not, for his sake. But that's pretty much all you would need. Now I'll share, this is one of my blogs. It's called In the Name of Who, What, .blogspot. And there's another name you should read up on, Edward Whiteman. He was the last English person to be killed for heresy. Again, this was a local pastor of a small town in England. I believe it's 1612. Yeah, that's the date. And he came out again with non-Trinitarian views and different views about the state of the dead. He believed the dead are not alive, and that's a big no-no. And he was burned twice over. He was burned. And you will find out why as you read his very fascinating story. Now, here's our website, focusonthekingdom.org. So this is the ministry, our ministry, the ministry I currently work for, called Restoration Fellowship. And here I'll just leave you with one of our websites. So we have many websites, by the way, the Human Jesus, Jesus Kingdom Gospel. But I'll leave you for the sake of this interview with ChristEnemyLove.com. This is a very important website with good history here. I put together a timeline of the nonviolent view of the early church, and the so-called early church fathers were all for nonviolence, by the way. So that's one thing that, although we disagree in many other things, the church councils preached nonviolence, which is amazing. Councils like Nicaea, which again, we don't agree with in terms of Jesus being God and all that, and we have media and so on. So this is a website you can look at for more information on this view. And it's really a simple view. And by the way, that's a depiction of just a painting of this man here in the center. If you can see, that's Constantine during the battle of, I believe, in 312 AD, when he saw the vision in heaven, and he supposedly converted to Christianity. I say supposedly because he was a sort of semi-pagan too. So, and he was a warrior. He was obviously an emperor. So he was doing things that a Christian should not do, like, go to war. So anyway, but because of him, there was religious tolerance when it came to Christianity, early Christianity. So that's just a depiction. So yeah, check out the articles here, and I think you might be well placed for your pacifist or non-resistance teachings there. So
we will put all of these links in the description also of the video, so people will be able to find them and the names of the books that you were recommending, Carlos. Thank you again, Carlos, for joining me today and for making us more aware of what has been happening for centuries, all in the name of Christianity.
That's right. And once again, thank you for inviting me.
So I hope that this history will encourage people who attend some of the churches that were mentioned at the end of the video here to take a deeper look at their church's history and reconsider maybe where they hang their hats Sunday morning. Because unfortunately, Calvin's teachings have infiltrated many churches and have contributed to many false teachings promoted in Christianity. On May 1st, we will be hosting a panel discussing Calvin's horrendous teaching on predestination. We will have a Q&A at the end as time permits. And you can click the link in the description below this video for a reminder or to watch the video. And if it has already happened at the time of watching this, we will have a link to the recording of that predestination panel. Thank you for joining us today and watching, and please do subscribe to our channel and hit the little bell below to get notifications when other videos and events come out. Thank you so much, and have a blessed day.